In this episode, I have a conversation with Walter Williams, host of the podcast Deep Discussion, certified life coach, and a poet. And he's a dad and husband too. I came across Walter on Twitter. He had responded to one of my reflection questions, so I checked out his profile. All I had to know was that he was a poet. I love poets. I'm a groupie for a lot of them, and I have been trying to find one who is brave enough to chat with me. It seems poets are shy. Poets are also special people because they seem to be at least semi-aware of their role as vessels for creative intelligence, which wants to mix with their unique experience of being human to create something that can only be created in partnership with creative intelligence. Poetry calls on images, and images are the language of the unconscious, which speaks through metaphors and symbols to get around our mind before our mind interprets in a way that only affirms and confirms what the mind thinks it already knows. Of course, the mind does this to protect us. So those people who say things like, I just don't get poetry, usually say it with a defensive attitude. And I wonder if that comes from a semi-awareness of the fear of what's in their own unconscious. So anyway, poets have an openness that's rare, a willingness to surrender to something bigger than themselves, and the capacity to be vulnerable, which is the number one requirement for deep connection with ourselves, with other human beings, and the divine or God or whatever you want to call the transcendent around you. So I also took a listen to a couple of Walter's podcast episodes, and they didn't disappoint me. I just love Walter's capacity for self-reflection, and I think you're going to enjoy our conversation. So let's get started. Welcome, Walter. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I am great. So let's start by you just telling us about your life. What's going on in your life and this interesting mix you have of something financial during the day, but yet you gravitated toward being a life coach and you're a poet and you've got a podcast. So just tell us how all that happened.
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, I'm in the financial industry in my my full-time day-to-day job. And I've always had a passion for numbers, for math, and problem solving. So, I have been pretty much studying and working in risk for probably about the last maybe 7 to 10 years. And it's just something that I'm really passionate about because there's a lot of opportunity to grow, create connections, and you know the I guess you could say the similarity between both what I do, with poetry and with my job is the opportunity to think and utilize my brain at a high
Mm.
level. So that's what I love to do in my day to day. But how I started doing poetry and life coaching, I had experienced some turmoil about a decade ago and was really kind of searching for answers and really was trying to say, what is all of this about? Because things have been so great for a while. I just recently purchased a house. I had just finished getting my master's degree, and things were just going great. And then suddenly, I start, trying to meet new people and dating and all of that stuff, and things just kind of hit a snag. And um, I just felt like the best way for me to really like I guess regather myself is to write poetry, because poetry is something I've done all my life since I was in middle school. I used to be in like the poetry clubs and all of that stuff. And poetry is a way that I, regather myself, kind of like get my thoughts together and try to, because sometimes what you say to people and how you share things with people don't really make sense to them. So when I have a pen and a piece of paper and I just write my thoughts down, things just kind of like sometimes a message is created and what my experiences are trying to tell me.
That's amazing. So first of all, it's like you have this kind of this balance between the masculine and the feminine, because accounting and risk management, what could be like a more sort of masculine style of consciousness, right? It's
Yeah,
like it makes sense. It's reason. 2 + 2 needs to equal 4. It's logical. And then you
right.
have this whole other part of you, which is the mysterious feminine, the meandering, being open to the unknown, which is where poetry comes from, really. So it's like you have the best of both worlds, kind of. So I love it. And also you had that unraveling experience.
Yeah.
where you're like, you didn't even know why,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Yeah,
And
exactly.
and so you had an intuition about poetry being sort of a way to make sense of things, that you couldn't figure out with your mind. Just like I had the irrational calling to study depth psychology when my life fell apart. I was like, I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know what needs to be fixed exactly. I just know it's just something is all wrong, right? So
Right.
I love it. That's just a great example. So thanks for sharing that.
No.
Oh, and I suspect that you have a poem to start us off with as well.
Yes, I do. So I just wanted to make sure there's a question later where you're talking about reading a poem too. Are
Hmm.
we going to revisit this poem or you wanted me to prepare another poem? Because I have two, but I just didn't know.
Oh, you could share too. More is
Okay.
better. More is better.
Okay, so I'll start with the first one. This is one I just wrote entitled Checkmate.
Mm.
Um, and it goes, I've been down every road. I've played it tough. Now has come the time when enough is enough. I've tried being strong, but eventually felt weak, oftentimes asserting my will, left unable to speak.
Mm.
My mind has become numb. My thoughts are on a pause, constantly retracing my steps, unaware of the cause. I kept asking questions, the answers left more. I stopped ringing the bell and started banging the door. The door finally opened, but the wind blew it shut. Becoming visibly frustrated, I decided to give up. Walking down those steps, I slightly lose ground, not falling. I'm sorry. I slightly lose ground, keeping my balance, not falling down. It served as a reminder that though I am weary, there will come a time when I will see things clearly.
Oh my gosh, that's beautiful. Was there anything in particular that like inspired that poem? I mean, it sort of just captures the whole, really, it captures the whole individuation journey. Like you kind of like touch through all the phases.
Yeah, so over the last probably 6 months or so, I've been dealing with some stressful circumstances in my
Hmm.
workplace. And I've probably written like maybe 5 or 6 poems
Mm.
based on this situation alone.
Mm.
But that one I wrote when sometimes when you go through these things, I'm an avid person ever since I experienced what I experienced about a decade ago when I started doing this, is to try to find the why in each
Mm.
experience that is taking place. And sometimes what happens is with me recently, I used that and kept trying to say, maybe this is what I'm being taught. No, that's not what I'm being taught because the experience didn't get any better. So, and I felt as though, when I thought that things were getting better, sometimes I guess I'll learn a lesson in the experience and I'll be
Yeah.
told that like, okay, this is how it should be, but it's not that way right now. So how are you going to fix it? And I think and that's what that poem was really saying. Sometimes you keep searching for answers and trying to say, what is the answer to this? What is going on? What are you trying to tell me? What is the universe trying to show me?
Hmm.
And you keep finding yourself asking that question and going down different avenues of thinking, okay, maybe this is what it's trying to tell me. But again, things don't change. So you say, all right, I'm gonna try a different path. And then you're like, okay, I see a little bit more here, but it's still
Hmm.
not, the full answer. So it's just about taking something from each experience and carrying it to the next. And I'm actually working on a poem now that's talking about like pretty much like going up a ladder or climbing a mountain.
Hmm.
And each step like may get tougher, but it's just because you gain more knowledge, and every time you gain something new, more is expected of you in the next step.
Well, I love that. That's what I was going to say is that, as you try this and as you try that and as you try that, and that's not it, and that's not it, and that's not it, there is something that you picked up along the way. And it reminds me of one of the things that Oprah Winfrey said when she said, when you try something and it's not, and sometimes it takes great courage to try that first thing. Like when I left my town in my 50s for the first time, well, except for traveling, but to move. And I got there, and after a year, I was like, I knew I wasn't going to stay there. So I could have thought of that as like, oh, I made the wrong decision. But she says sometimes when you try something and it's still not quite right, it's not ideal, it just clarifies for you where you're wanting to go and that you actually needed that situation. So I can see why you're called to life coaching, because that's not obvious for people to keep
Right.
asking the why, because they are in the meantime feeling really depressed or anxious, and it takes a certain kind of like presence of mind to slow things down and wonder about the why when you're in the middle of your mess. So, and you know what they also say about healers, that, or teachers, that you when you're called to teach or coach or whatever, what you're doing is what you need to do for yourself, right? So
Right.
you teach what you need to learn. I found that in my own situation. So
Yeah.
that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem.
So let's dig into poetry. I wrote my first poem after my midlife unraveling, and it was prompted by this relationship I was in, my first post-divorce relationship. After I had a bunch of online dating, that wasn't serious, but then I got swept up by the archetypes and in this relationship with a much younger man. And where I wrote my first poem was in a prison visiting room. So that's all. Yeah, you heard that right. That's all in the
Yeah.
coming memoir. But anyway, so talk about being in an awkward moment. This man that I was still so attracted to said, "Let's write poetry." And I was like, "No." I started sweating, literally, like that would be the most vulnerable thing you could make me do, was like on the spot write poetry. So I had to be forced, and I did it. Over the next 2 years, I relaxed into this mysterious way that the unconscious communicates through poetry. And I settled into a particular format called tanka. So the haiku, most people are probably familiar with. I don't know, it's like 3 lines and
Yeah.
what, 5 syllables. Well, the tanka
Yeah.
just adds a couple more lines and a couple more syllables. So it's not as constraining as the haiku, but it's not too long and open-ended, because that makes me nervous too. So it's interesting how then, and I was studying depth psychology. So, of course, depth psychology is all about the unconscious. So, it's also, in addition to being a really spiritual psychology, it's a creative psychology as well, because we allow the unconscious to speak through creative means.
Mhm.
So, I found then that I would have a desire to write a tanka poem during, I don't know, certain moments where I was like, I wonder, but my mind isn't really getting at it. And then the words that came out helped me gain the meaning of a situation, or helped me gain the insight in a way that my mind couldn't do it. So it's been a while since I wrote a poem, but I would love to dig into when you found poetry, or when it found you, and how it has played a role in your life since then. You've kind of alluded to it a little bit. And has poetry led you places, and has it helped you find meaning in your life? And, just how do poems emerge? And like, there's a million questions I have, but just tell me a little bit about your relationship with poetry.
Yeah, sure. So like I said to you earlier, I've enjoyed writing poetry since I was a kid. But when I used to write poetry as a kid, it was more so like, I mean, I had fun with it now, don't get me wrong, but it
Mhm.
was more so for fun,
Yeah.
just, a way to kind of like, say, all right, this is my thing. I have my claim to fame. Everybody, when they were younger, wanted to say, Walter has his thing, and poetry was one of the things that I wanted to have, but it was almost like, everybody like to use analogies of relationships these days. So it's kind of like a casual relationship with me and poetry now. Then, but over time, like as I've experienced more and more as an adult, I've become more intimate with poetry, because
Mm.
that's how I communicate how I'm feeling. When I don't understand what is going on, or when I want to utilize my experiences to inspire and encourage other people to make the best of their situations. But what poetry has done for me is really kind of like helped me escape the troubles that I'm experiencing, and really find it within myself to say, am I tripping, or am I missing something here?
Mm.
Just kind of like, again, regather myself, because what happens when we go through these experiences, we sometimes most of the times we assume the worst of things and we think that, oh, they don't care about us, we're not good enough or whatever the case may be. But sometimes what poetry does is it keeps me in the moment. It doesn't, push me far ahead to think the worst of things are going to come. So I have a really deep passion for poetry because it does so many things for me outside of how it helps me, again, regather and recollect myself when I'm experiencing tough things. It's a way for me to inspire others through my messages as well. So, as a life coach, focusing on life skills, I like to create messages that I want people to learn from, maybe things that I've experienced, things that I've seen. And I think that when I write it out in a poetry form, things just really click for me better.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why every podcast episode I do, I start off with a poem because it's almost like it's almost like an exercise for myself to say, all right, let's get right into this. And once I write and read the poem, that's really like how I get myself engaged and ready to deliver the message to my audience.
I love it. I love it. And do you, in your life coaching, do you actually offer, this to some of your clients who might find it a useful tool for themselves? And also, like, do you teach them or say like poetry is available to you too, because poetry is part of who you are.
That's true.
And, like over time, as we settle into how we do like depth psychology coaching or life coaching, we're bringing us to the table. So in depth psychology, I do a lot of exploring dream images with clients, and then I kind of teach them how to do it on their own. So I was just curious if if your clients know this about you and they're like, hey, I want to write poetry, like teach me how to write poetry. So because it might be a useful tool for them too.
Yeah, that's something that I'm definitely open to doing. If a client was interested in, learning about how to write poetry, what I would tell them really is it's really just about like, connecting with yourself, not letting the outside noise really be a dictator of what you're writing and what you're expressing. Talk about what your thoughts are saying. And and it's okay to come back. You don't have to like write everything in that moment because sometimes a thought pop up in my head and I'm like, that sounds like a good idea for a poem. And it's really just about connecting with yourself. And that's what poetry to me is all about. It's my way of communicating to the universe or to God or to whoever with, what am I experiencing and does it feel right? Is it right what I'm thinking based on what I'm experiencing? So what I would tell them, if they're open to learning how to write poetry, absolutely. I feel poetry is a strong tool to help you really kind of like keep yourself in line and kind of like help keep yourself together, especially during tough times.
Yeah, and I could just see you being really good at that. So, writing poetry is a healing, right? But I don't know if there's a lot of people who sort of help others use it as healing. Anyway, I was just curious about that. So, I don't know if this would be considered poetry, but during the most difficult stage of my marriage falling apart after, 24 years, this was very difficult. When I didn't know what to do, I just suddenly started journaling. So it was actually February of 2013 when I wrote, I can't live this way anymore, but I didn't know what the problem was. I didn't know what was wrong. I just knew something awful was going on. And after I journaled for 6 months, I went back and I read what I wrote, and I could see this pattern that had been hiding beneath the surface in my relationship. So, and then I journaled more about, I read a book by Iyanla Van Zandt. I don't know if you know her, but she's like the ultimate spiritual life coach. And she's got, Oprah found her, and she's got a show called Iyanla Fix My Life. Anyway, she wrote this book called In the Meantime. And one of the questions to journal about was, what did you learn about love as a child? And I was like, wow, what a good question. And I journaled. And so the 6 months of journaling about just observing my daily life and my relationship, and then coupled with reflecting about what I learned about love as a child, all of a sudden this desire came out of me to write like a kind of story but it was all these little short sentences like, this is a story about a little girl. Her mother needed her to prove she was a better mother. That it was all these little shorts. So it was kind of like a really long poem. It had like 50 lines, and it sort of reflected my hopes, my dreams, my whole life up to this point. And it helped me make sense then of how I found myself, where I found myself. Like, how did I get here? Because of course we want to blame everybody else, right? But it's like, well, I got myself here. And it captured this whole 50 years of my life. And anyway, so I loved watching your YouTube videos where you feature some of your poems.
Yep.
And in that, when I listened to them, that just made me think about, I think that was a poem that I wrote, but it was like really super long. And right, like I journal at that point, it was probably 100 pages of journaling, and I still wasn't getting it. And then all of a sudden, writing that poem, long story, these little short sentences, put it all together for me. And then I ended up sharing that with my former husband, and it was like the most vulnerable thing I had done. So anyway, so I asked you to choose a poem that's meaningful for you, one of your many poems, and read it to my listeners and viewers, and let us into your inner world, and how it came to be about, and how it helped you find meaning in whatever part of that life, if it's current or old or whatever. So let's have another poem.
Sure. So this one actually is on my YouTube channel. It's called Shine. I've got a lot of rave reviews for this one. Um, but you have come so very far, yet still you aren't a star. Pursuing the moon in hopes you'll see, pushed back by clouds and powers to be. A bright glare appears upon your skin, filled with excitement you seek within, only to find its source was detached, leaving you to think you are no match. Moving away swiftly, having little to give, a light shines again, you ignore its bid. It unceasingly follows you to a fit. You yell, "Get lost, I'm not falling for it. I've wanted to shine like stars at night, but constantly I'm betrayed in broad daylight. If it's not meant to be, just say so. No need playing with my mind, giving me false hope. Stars shine deep, but mainly at night. You stand with the sun because you shine so bright."
Oh my gosh.
So,
Oh, I could journal about that.
so before I dive into what this poem, what the meaning of this poem was, I wanted to talk about, or just kind of like give a brief, I guess, follow up on what you said with journaling. I feel like poetry really is a style of journaling, really, because when I write poetry, again, it's like a journal for me. It's like something that I've either experienced, something that I've seen. And usually I think what happens is with journaling, a lot of the times we take journals as almost like diaries, like things you want to keep secret, that only you want your friend, that you will only want your closest, bestest friend to know. Whereas with poetry, I like to share it. So journaling, I think, is a type of poetry, or poetry is a type of journaling. It's just sometimes one may be more secretive than the other. But when I write poetry, it's something that I went through, something that I'm experiencing or seeing. So I do think that they kind of go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Out of my journaling, I have a Word document. So it's like 2,000 pages of journaling at this point, but I'll go back and I'll just be prompted one day to wonder about images. So, I recall the image of baby coming up in my dreams, for example, and I'll go back and search for all of the dreams about babies. And I eventually will create a blog post that includes a story and how that image helped me make sense of, whatever it was. So yeah, journaling is like this source. It's a place where you just share whatever. There's no right way to journal, and out of it new creations can come as you make meaning of things. So I'm so glad that you shared that. Absolutely.
So yeah, no problem. I thought that was really intriguing what you shared about journaling. So with this poem Shine, though, this poem was I wrote this poem after my wife and I had a conversation one day about how, so many times people want fame and fortune, and they want, sometimes fame and fortune is about either money, or being known and,
Yeah.
people like being popular.
Hmm.
But I wrote this poem because it was a reminder to myself that I don't have to I don't have to be on the biggest stage, but as
Hmm.
long as I'm making the biggest impact to someone or a big enough impact for someone in that moment, then I'm shining. And
Yeah.
that's what I sometimes have to remind myself as a life coach. Because when I created this platform, you know, I kept trying to condition and tell myself over and over again, this is not a means of me trying to get popular or get famous. I want to be able to connect with people, to reach and touch people that may be going through tough times or need some inspiration. And, when sometimes I get to those moments where, you're doing so well, you're enjoying what you're doing, but sometimes you think to yourself, the root of all evil, money, you start thinking to yourself, how can I make money off of this?
Hmm.
Or how can I monetize this? That's a word that we hear so often. But essentially I have to sometimes go back to this poem to remind myself that I shine to those that are around me because they know that I'm a great human being and that my purpose and my mission is to encourage and inspire those that are around me. So I don't necessarily have to be invited to be on a stage where 15,000 people are around to feel validated in who
Right.
I am or what I have to bring. We can shine in pretty much in any path of life as long as we are true to who we are and we mean well and we're well intended to those that we come around.
Oh, I love that because there is like this external pressure about how, you know, about how to define your meaning and your usefulness and your worth, right? And it really comes from the inside, not the outside. But sometimes we don't realize that some of our desires are motivated by this hidden unconscious agenda. Like I was an activist in my 20s, like, oh, I'm going to leave the world a better place. And it wasn't until I was 48 when I received this award for contributing to the community. And I was making my speech and then I was reading my speech and I had this moment where I believed something I read. And I said something like, I realized that I make a difference walking around being me. And I just started sobbing. And then after that, I felt shame because I realized that my unconscious hidden agenda, another agenda for my activism work was to have validation mirrored back to me.
Yeah.
And if we're right, so many times we think we're doing something righteous, but sometimes there's this other little hidden agenda. But then when we realize it and have awareness of it, we can let it go. It's liberating. And then we come into deeper relationship with the thing that we're doing, our calling, what we're called to do, because it's not for the purpose of the ego, it's for the purpose of, the greater good. So, oh my God. So see, look at that one poem. You could have a conversation for an hour about it. Oh, I see why it resonates. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
problem.
And in my description box, I'll have links to whatever, but I could link to specific poems. Let's link to that poem specifically.
Sure,
And then
absolutely.
also your podcast and all that other stuff. So as a depth psychologist, we believe that the unconscious wants to create, it seeks to create. And the purpose of its creation is to expand consciousness raising. And for me, you could say that I'm really addicted to science fiction and certain kinds and certain films. I don't know, I experience as a kind of poetry, really, because I'm really open to having images work on me. So just like dreams, there during a time of my midlife reconstruction, you could say there was a series of films, mostly science fiction and superhero films, that I saw as many as 8 times because I experienced them as gaining insights about something that was going on bigger in the collective. So for me, I don't know, some film images seem like another kind of poetry. And one of them is I came of age in the 80s, a time when there was expansion of consciousness about women, but there was also this like backlash and hatred about, women who wanted to be independent. But the movie Thelma and Louise, which kind of rocked the world, and
Yeah.
there's this, so many men critiquers were like, hated it because they didn't like this, this unleashing of anger, this righteous anger in the collective of women. And that image of the car, them driving off the cliff, and they're choosing death over oppression because they know they're not going to be believed about what happened to them, is, for me, it's like a kind of poetry. But in our life, we move around so quickly. Like, we watch a movie and then we're on to the next movie, and instead of like really allowing the images to work on us. And
Yeah.
I think poetry slows you down, right? It slows you down. Well, it tries to slow you down anyway. So I was talking about that, and I talk about like the unconscious is the unknown, which is really God. It's the source of creative intelligence. So, like, what is your relationship with creative intelligence, and how do you understand? Maybe you haven't thought about this, but how do you understand your role as this one little human being, in relationship to a kind of, consciousness, how it's in service to humanity, even if you don't really know exactly how or why?
Yeah, no, that's really deep. And I think when it comes to like the creative intelligence, I think that, words words mean a lot to people. And I think that, a lot of the times people say actions speak louder than words, but at the same time, how you how you convey and share those words is really what's meaningful to people. So when it comes to the conscious, sometimes, somebody can say something to you and say something to me, say the same exact thing, but it means something different to you than it does to me, based on, our experiences, based on our thoughts and our beliefs. So I think that when it comes to creative intelligence and the conscious and all of that stuff, I really have to, as a poet, find a way to kind of like find a middle ground, but at the same time, know and have a strong belief in what I want my messages to convey. Because what the messages that I share aren't going to be received the same way by everybody that hears it. So I think that what it is with me as a creator is to build as many relationships as I can, learn about as many people as I can, know and understand different personalities, and say, okay, when I write this poem or share this poem, the message that I want to be delivered, I want to make sure that it's being delivered to a person that's going through this situation, or a person that may feel this way, because you want to be careful not to assume that every poem you write is for every single person. And that's the integrity and the responsibility of a creator. You want to be sure and be careful that you understand your target audience. And your target audience does not have to be the same for every single thing that you create. Think about musicians, for example. Every song that they write is not going to always be for every single person that listens to it. I have favorite artists that write songs that I'm really like, I don't really care for that song that too much. And it could be because either it just doesn't sound right to me, or it doesn't reflect anything. Because sometimes, there are certain things that may not sound good to people, but it has a place in their life based on what they see and experience. So I think that really, it's sometimes about flavor, and sometimes it's about substance. The flavor is, oh, is this going to really make this person want to dance? Is it going to make them want to get up on their feet and just, is it going to push them along? But sometimes you want to write or share things that make people reflect and think and say to themselves, I never thought about it that way, or I never seen, experiences happen that way. So it's just all about how you want to deliver things, and you can always do both. But I will say, for myself, I'm more of a thinker. I like to get people to reflect and to think about themselves, about what the world is trying to tell them and show them, and how the world wants them to show up. And it's funny, I'm actually in the middle of writing another poem called Show Up, because and it just kind of like just dawned on me the other day when I was on my way taking my son to his grandparents' house the other day. like all of these lines just kind of like popped in my head about how the world wants you to show up, or how you should show up in the world. And I think that, it's just about delivering meaningful messages to people, especially as a thinker. Now, there are people that make things that, just want to make people feel good. And trust me, I appreciate those because I need those for myself.
Right.
And I want to make stuff that make people feel good too. And I do that. But probably 80% of the poetry I write is poetry that makes people think and reflect, because I feel like as a life coach, that's my job, to get people to think and reflect on their life, and in turn eventually feel better or feel good about where their life is headed, or things that they can do to make their life better. Because what happens is we get so caught up and so wrapped up in the next thing. What's next? We want instant gratification. We want to jump, as soon as we finally accomplish a goal, we're right on to the next, ready to see, all right, what's next? I didn't got this big time job. All right, now it's time to go get the house. Okay, now it's time to go have kids. They just ready to just go and go and go. But sometimes, like you said, poetry for me is a way of telling people, slow down, reflect on what it is you have, how you got there, show some gratitude as well. Be grateful for what you have, because poetry definitely does help me to slow down, kind of like keep me neutral for a little bit, so that I can say, all right, this is good. This is good. What's going on with me right now? How can I make it better? As opposed to how can I jump to the next thing to make my situation better? Let's make this one thing in my situation better. It's kind of like microing things a little bit, if that's even a word. But.
Yeah. So that makes me think of two things. One is that I love this spiritual saying that is, if you are being authentically you, which is kind, of course, right? But you're being authentic. And when you're kind of prompting people to self-reflect, you're disrupting something, right? And so even in the right, but if that is what you are called to do, then other people's responses to you is none of your business. Like, I love that saying, right? And so that makes me want to ask you, like, have you ever had the experience where you feel called to write a poem, but then you feel this other presence that's writing through you and with you, and you write something and you're like, oh my God, did I just write that? Like, you can tell it wasn't just you that wrote it, that there was this like presence of creative intelligence flowing through you.
Yeah. So, wow. When I first began, like, well, I don't want to say first began, when my poetry journey kind of like really took off, when I wrote my first book called My Thoughts in Writing. There was this poem that I wrote that I still sometimes think back to and be like, whoa, I must have, it almost felt like my life or my mind just kind of like flipped and just really like just sat there for a minute. It was just like, let's turn this thing around. It was a poem I wrote called Numb. And I was like really just in this spot where I was just like, what is really going on here? Like, and I think what happened with me was like, I couldn't process my thoughts the way that I usually do. And I couldn't, develop or gain any kind of understanding on what was taking place. And I think that what that poem was telling me is you need to stay still, because I've written poems for myself. I wrote one called Be Still, and that one connected with me, but I still didn't stay still. It's kind of like, it's almost like, it sounds good and, oh, let's share it with the people and let them know. But I wasn't really doing it. I wasn't doing what I was sharing. So then I wrote this poem called Numb, and I'm like, and it's almost kind of like my body took over my mind, really, because I wasn't really like in a space where I was writing something where I was like, all right, let me write this to shake up the world or to get people going. It was really a poem that really just was for myself, because I was really in a really vulnerable place at that moment. And I felt like my situation just kind of said, you keep saying you're going to be still, but you haven't done it. So now it's time for me to really put you in your place and to make you sit down and stay still. And in that moment, I was like, I don't know what's going on here, but I need to write. And what I wrote and what came out of my writing, I look back at it sometimes and just be like, I can't believe I wrote that. But what that does is it really reflects and it kind of like humbles you and it makes you say, I don't want to be back in that place again. So what I learned in that experience, I really need to make sure I take it and and I take it with humility and with greatness and understand that you sometimes your body has a way of telling you to slow down. Sometimes people say, they're exhausted, they're not feeling well because they keep doing so much. And for me, that was me mentally at that time. I could not properly process thoughts the way that I usually do. Like I'm going through stuff and I'm just like, what is going on? And I couldn't really, and like things would almost like seemingly get, worse. And I just couldn't gravitate or figure out what was going on. But, writing the poem was always like, and that from that moment on, I think this was like probably 2013 on was when I really started writing poetry, and it really became a staple of something that I would consistently do whenever I'm going through something. And in that moment, I was going through a lot. And
well, it's a perfect example of in that moment you did surrender to creative intelligence. So there's the saying, be still and know that I am. Know that I am God, creative intelligence. And it is only in stillness that you can tap into that. The mind just wants to protect us constantly, even if it's to keep us in a dysfunctional situation. It's familiar. So thanks for sharing that. Yes, I knew it. I knew you had that moment. I could tell. So I love this conversation. So we kind of talked about like encouraging other peoples to explore poetry, either, as a reader or listener, and really going to your website will be a great way for them to start, because they can just enjoy you reading your own poems and watch you read poems. And and it is such a vulnerable thing. So I've loved this conversation. How can people support you or find you, see you, check out your services as a life coach and follow you? And like, how do they find all that?
Sure. So you can visit my website at deepdiscussion.org. You can also email me at beinspired@deepdiscussion.org. And all of my social media and YouTube links are on the website. So if you want to listen to any of my poetry, you can click the YouTube link and listen to some of the poems I wrote on there. I'm actually in the process of, again, writing new material, and I'm going to start sharing more of what I've already written. I haven't really put as much out as I would like to, but raising a 2-year-old, it's really hard to find time for that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can visit my website, and if you're interested in like learning about writing poetry, learning more about my poetry, and I'm trying to do more like poetry exhibitions. So I would like to like go to different locations, like night spots or wherever, to do live poetry. You can contact me at 443-916-5009. And I look forward to connecting with people, because poetry is the foundation of all of this. Like life skills coaching is what I share with a lot of people and tell them that I can offer to them. But poetry is really the heart of it all. That's how this journey started for me. It started with me writing poetry and wanting my messages to be shared through poetry. But I added the life skills coaching part because there were some people that the poetry just couldn't connect with, or, some people just like, I don't get what he's saying. And I knew that I had a message, and I had a purpose in this season or in these seasons to deliver inspiration to people. So I took it a step further. But poetry is always going to be my platform, and it's going to always be the heart and soul of what I do. So if you want a deep, inspirational, and motivational poet, I'm your guy.
Oh, what a great way to end. I love it. Thank you, Walter, for a conversation full of depth, vulnerability, and space for creative intelligence to be present. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your enthusiasm and interest in poetry. It really means a lot. A lot of people take for granted how how impactful and important poetry is. So I appreciate you having me, and this conversation was great, and it makes it really inspires me to go write more.
So I'm so glad. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Walter Williams and you feel inspired to try poetry out for yourself. I'll put links in the description box to Walter and links to a couple of my blogs where I shared some of my Tanka poems. Remember, our soul, our unconscious, speaks to us in many ways to get our attention, to prompt us to explore something deep inside yourself. Take a moment to be still and see what happens, see what comes out. Write or draw, and allow a deeper part of yourself to express something that can't be processed by the mind yet and can't be articulated through words. See what happens. Until next time.